I'm Gary's friend Lee, and I just want to tell a story quickly just to kind of settle my nerves for what I really would like to say. I remember one day when Gary called me up and he said, let's go to Death Valley. I've never seen the desert. It's springtime. It was about April. It's going to be a full moon. It'll be glorious. I'm going to rent one of those great big GM motorhomes. Remember the ones that really were far and above everything else back then. Now things have passed those up, I realize. But I said, can you drive one of those? He says, it's just a big fucking truck. I said, okay. So we took Ronnie and Michael, and off to the desert we went. And Gary and I barbecued dinner that night, and the kids went to bed, and we sat up telling stories. It was a full moon, like it's going to be tonight. And Gary looked at me about, 2 in the morning, and he said, wouldn't it be a hoot if in the morning the kids woke up and there was snow instead of being in Death Valley? And I said, what? And he said, yeah, let's go to Mammoth. It might have been the mushrooms we ate that night. But nevertheless, off to Mammoth we drove, and the curtains were closed on the GM motorhome. And remember, there were curtains in the front, to keep the driver's area private. So Gary said, we'll keep it like that, and in the morning I'll ask the kids to get up and take the garbage out. He says, just check their faces out. And sure enough, when the kids woke up that morning and I looked at their faces, when Gary said, would you please, and they were barefooted. They didn't know, they thought they were going to step out into Death Valley. It was amongst the most memorable moments in my life. The joy in Gary's face, those eyes, you just knew how happy he was to have played that joke on his kids. But really, what I wanted to say about Gary was that, and I think you've all said it in your own ways, I know I feel it, he was larger than life. The day that I met Gary was at a party at my friend Jeff's house, and Gary just struck me as somebody that I ought to get to know better, and I exchanged phone numbers with him. And you might do that with a woman or two at a party, but you don't usually do that with guys. At least I didn't. But Gary seemed special somehow, and I thought I would do that. And when the next day I get this call, it was about, 3 in the afternoon. This is Gary. I said, who? Gary. Now, I spoke Texan back then. I've lost my accent, but I always had trouble talking to Gary in his New York accent. And finally it dawned on me, this was the guy I met at the party the night before. He said, can you come get me? I said, where are you? He says, I'm in the emergency room in Santa Monica at the hospital. I said, and you called me? He said, yeah. He says, I don't know too many people out here. Really, I need you to come and get me. I've got to go to New York tonight. And, I was in the McClure Tunnel, and this yo-yo in front of me cut me off and slid my bike, and I need a ride. And I came and I got Gary, and I thought, wow. This is really someone that is not like me. I drove him home, and when we got to his house, he was living up in Calabasas, and a lot of you might remember that house. It was something else. And Gary went upstairs and got in the bathtub. I mean, he was black and blue, as you would expect, and that was before all the nice motorcycle gear that people wore today. And he said, why don't you make some food for us? I didn't cook that much in those days, but I thought, okay. He said, just look in the freezer. There's plenty in there. I went down, I opened the freezer. It was full. All Kraft macaroni and cheese. Now, Gary was on his way to New York. He called me. He said, you got to come get me out of the tub. I said, what? I said, this is getting way too personal for me. He said, no, really. He says, I just need to get a little help getting up. I said, you're going to get on a plane to New York? He said, yeah, I got to go back there. I got business. I got to be back there. Gary was larger than life. And while I am so angry that he's gone, I can't ever picture Gary having gotten sick and grown old. The way he went was the way he lived his life. He was something special, and I will always remember him for being special, as I'm sure everybody here does too. I'm sure there are lots of stories, and I'm not going to keep you with mine any longer, but he meant a lot to me. He was my friend.
This is Andy, who I met first, who introduced me to Gary.
Yes, I am the guy that's responsible for introducing Scotty into our community. I hope you won't hold that against me. One of my stories about Gary Allan, we were out on the Mulholland riding, and something went wrong with Gary's bike. So we pulled off the side of the road, and Gary made some calls, and suddenly a car stopped, and it was Jay Leno in one of his cars. So he leans out and says, "You guys okay?" Gary says, "Yeah, I got somebody coming to rescue us." Jay Leno says, "You want anything?" Quick as a flash, Gary says, "Yeah, how about your garage?" But my Gary Allan moment happened in Morro Bay. Gary was driving this really badass black Triumph motorcycle, and I wanted to ride it really very badly. And I said, "Hey, Gary, do you think there's a chance that I can take that bike for a ride?" And he said, "Andy, you can do whatever you want." And I realized that was the first time anybody had ever said that to me. And because it was Gary Allan, I believed him right away. It really was a life-changing moment. And I'll never forget it. I'd like to mention our friend Linda, who sat in an airport in Minneapolis for 19 hours trying to get out here today. Unfortunately, she couldn't get a non-rev flight, but she did make the effort. Also, my neighbor, Eric and Sissy, asked me to convey their condolences to you. And I would like to just thank Barbara for sharing him with us for those 28 years. I was really honored.
Good afternoon. My name is TJ, and I'm standing here to represent that Gary had friends of color as well. I was fortunate enough to start working for EMC about 10 years ago. And I was born and raised in Tennessee. My father is a minister, very religious background. And I'm in my edit bay. And the next thing I hear is, "There are no effing pens around here. Where's an effing pen?" I'm like, what the heck kind of place I'm in now? That this man, and I'm introduced to him going, "Oh, he's one of the owners." I'm like, what kind of place is this? But as I got to know Gary, he and Barbara created an environment where I have friends for life through EMC. And even though I'm not there anymore, EMC was the first place that I started, where I actually did stuff with my coworkers after work. And Gary was just a force. And he greeted you, and as I sat there and listened to people talk about the bear hug, soon as Gary hit the office, we knew Gary had hit the office. And he would make his rounds with, "Hey, doll." And I'm like, wow, you just felt like you were the only person in his life at that moment. And so I'm just grateful that I see that how his life has touched so many others as well as mine. And it's because of Gary that in 1 week, I heard the F word more times than I had in my entire life. So he will be terribly missed. And I love Barbara, Shane, Ryan. You guys, EMC, you're all like family to me. And the last thing I would say is, and I don't know if she's going to tell this, but we often have to warn new people who worked at the office, if they answered the phone, don't worry about the guy who calls and goes, "Who the F are you?" That's just Gary.
My name's Bob Clark, and I'm kind of one degree of freedom or 1 degree of separation from Gary. Actually knew Gary and Barbara and the family through our friends the Ponchiks. and kind of thinking back over the conference, I've seen Gary maybe 3 times a year, but over the last 15 years or so. Thinking about that and the kinds of stories that people have told about Gary today, kind of come into 3 flavors, and I've got one of those 3 flavors. But you know, it kind of reminds me that saying that we are sort of the sum total of all the relationships that we have, and thinking about that and thinking about all the relationships that Gary had with all of us, and who he was, and how he was informed by us, and how we are formed by our relationships with Gary, and pretty special to me. The 3 things that I kind of took away from this is stories that were about his favorite effing word, stories about how spontaneous and full of life Gary was, and the third stories which are about his heart, and that's kind of what my story was about. About 5 years ago, I had an accident, and I was in the hospital for 5 weeks. And again, I didn't know Gary that well. We didn't spend time. I never went on a ride with him. Whenever I went on vacation, didn't work with him. I didn't go to the parks with him. But Gary came and visited me in the hospital and brought a book for me to read. And the fact that he took time out of his busy schedule to think about me and come and visit me, just to me was an exhibit of who Gary was all about and the kind of heart that Gary had. And as you all say, that, you know, that was one of those things that touched me and said to me, gee, I'd like to be more like Gary as I grow older. So I miss him as well. But those kinds of things, I think, for us, for me in particular, to honor Gary is one of those things that if I can be more like that, is the way I honor Gary's life. Thanks.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I've just to sort of wrap this up and thank each and every one of you for coming here and sharing. And I know you have all got a hole in your heart just like mine. But if we all keep thinking about him and loving him the way we did, he's no anywhere but inside here. And he will go on forever, as far as I'm concerned, because I'll never forget that man until the day I die. He's just been a wonderful part in my life, and it's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm just so thankful for being his pal for so many years and spending so much quality time with him. We had so many fucking laughs, I'll tell you. Clara and me and him, we played a slot machine once in a wee funny casino, and we won $300, and I swear to God, everybody in the place thought we'd won the fucking lotto, you know? I was just, down front, fucking, oh, they won the big one, you know, but 300 fucking bucks, wow! That's it. It's just the way he was. Everything was so exaggerated. He was just such a lovely, lovely person. And Barbara, you're going to miss him, honey, but just fucking pick up the phone and call me, and you want to know what like he was and what have you, I'll bring it right back to you again. And all he ever says to me is, fucking nut. That's all you are, a fucking nut. And I just loved it when he said it, you know. But I want to thank you all for coming. And I think there's some wee refreshments and soft drinks and coffee and stuff down there a bit. And God bless you all, and we're going to miss him terribly. But that's about the end of the show, okay?